IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. The Takshashila Institution is based in Bangalore, and both Anirudh and I work in this city, though we're, of course, socially distancing and are working from our homes at present. But the history of Bangalore is never very far from us. It's easy for us to look at the city superficially and imagine it to be a colonial city. If you look at the names of the roads, you have an infantry road and a Cubbon road and a Queen's road. But of course, Bangalore's history goes back much further. And the name that's most talked about is Kempegowda. But really, there's a much more interesting and rich history of Bangalore that dates back to perhaps 8 centuries before Kempegowda. And today, Anirudh and I are going to talk about that history and try and make sense of what that is. Welcome, Anirudh.
Hey, Aditya.
Hey. Now, how far back can we start making sense of Bangalore's history? What is the first evidence that we have of this as a settlement?
The history of Bangalore actually goes far further back than we might imagine. Of course, that's not to say that a city that was recognizably called Bangalore itself existed, but as a general kind of area of human habitation, this region has been fairly important for nearly 2,000 years. There have been caches of Roman coins discovered here, which indicate that it may have been just generally a very important kind of trading location, which kind of makes sense overall if you kind of look at the geopolitics of southern India. You have the great plateau of the Deccan, which dominates most of Maharashtra and Karnataka, and towards the southern part of Karnataka kind of fades into these hilly areas, which eventually kind of gently incline towards the plains of Tamilakam. So these hills and this dry area was something that merchants would often have to traverse on their way to the rich ports of both the east and the west coast. And certainly going by the fact that so many Roman coins have been found here, there must have been settlements of merchants going back for at least 2,000 years, back to the reign of the Roman Emperor Augustus. But beyond the Roman coins, there isn't actually too much detail as to what was going on in Bangalore for a long period of time after the turn of the first millennium. The oldest archaeological remnant that is well known is the hero stone of a chap called Kittaya, who lived in northern Bangalore near Hebbal, where Manyata Tech Park now is. The fact that this particular remnant of Mr. Kittaya survives is because of the unique kind of geopolitics of the Deccan, which I was referring to. Further up in northern Karnataka, you have these very, very dry regions which seem to have been home to a kind of a warrior peasantry for quite a long time. Roughly around the 6th century, these warrior peasants start to venture further and further in their raids, start to get more and more militarily successful, which leads to the culmination of them founding a new kingdom under the dynasty called the Chalukyas. Now, the Chalukyas are one of the most recognizably famous dynasties in the history of Karnataka, which is kind of odd considering that for most of their reign, they were just focused in northern Karnataka, Maharashtra, and didn't really have too much to do in southern Karnataka. Southern Karnataka, where Bangalore now is, was part of a region called Gangavadi, which was dominated by a family called the Gangas. Especially compared to the Chalukyas, the Gangas weren't necessarily the richest and most famous of dynasties. They didn't have the most sophisticated kind of mechanism of extracting taxes from the land. They didn't really have they didn't have very deep kind of ties to the coast, especially unlike the Chalukyas, who are known to have conquered the Konkan and a number of very wealthy emporia along the west coast. But they were closely allied to the Chalukyas. Many Chalukya emperors are known to have married into the Ganga family. A lot of Chalukya queens have the name Ganga Devi, indicating that they were princesses or queens who were from the Ganga family. And roughly around the 8th century, what happens is that the Chalukyas get a little too obsessed with fighting wars in the Tamil country, as a result of which their grip over their northern territory starts to weaken. And the family known as the Rashtrakutas, who are vassals of the Chalukyas and who are broadly based around the Godavari Valley, eventually rise to overthrow the Chalukyas and claim the title of the overlordship of the Deccan, which of course is kind of contested by the Gangas, who aren't too happy about their in-laws being overthrown, and leads to a savage war when the Rashtrakutas invade southern Karnataka. Now, in the process of this invasion, our chap Kittaya dies. His hero stone is not the most elaborate hero stone that we've ever seen. Just for a little bit of context, a hero stone is basically a stone which depicts the death of a hero in battle, usually also with an image of him ascending to heaven with some very beautiful apsaras, and him being entertained by said beautiful apsaras in heaven while also worshipping his god. But Kittaya's hero stone is not your typical hero stone. It's just literally a slab of rock onto which somebody has carved a misshapen sort of man and a very crudely depicted horse. The man is being pierced by arrows or javelins which have been thrown by the horseman. And the inscription tells us that Kittaya was killed by the Rattas or the Rashtrakutas.
Right.
This is interesting for a lot of reasons. The first is that clearly Kittaya's family were the equivalent of some kind of minor nobility around northern Bangalore. They were evidently some kind of vassal chiefs under the Gangas, which is why they ended up getting sucked into a war against the Rashtrakutas. And the Rashtrakutas, incidentally, were very famous for their cavalry. If you go to the great Somanatha Temple in Ellora today, there are some fragmentary remains inside the Mahamandapa, the main hall, which show us what Rashtrakuta cavalry looked like. So these were guys who wore like these beautiful, like conical, slightly curved Persian-style helmets, and would charge into battle on their horses, throw javelins first, and then take out these short kind of cutting swords and then use them in close quarters combat. So it appears that Kittaya had an unfortunate run-in with one of these Rashtrakuta cavalrymen. And in the process, his family, after his death, created a hero stone and thus left us with the first concrete remnant from the early medieval period, which tells us a little bit about the lives of the people that lived in this area.
Right. So it would seem that some of the earliest concrete evidence of Bangalore comes actually from this fairly terrible geopolitical upheaval. Are there other hero stones from that period that tell us about the evolution of the city, perhaps its expansion, and what is the political dispensation like?
Absolutely. So again, I'd like to point out that the city of Bangalore, as it were, didn't really exist. A lot of the areas that we're accustomed to thinking of as part of Bangalore, like Begur or Iblur, places like that, were all very much their own kind of independent towns, independent villages, who often went out and raided each other, tried to seize each other's cattle, tried to seize each other's women, because especially in the Deccan, which is again this thorny, very dry kind of land, it wasn't easy to get a lot from the land. It wasn't enough to maintain a large population purely from agricultural produce. There were some innovative ways of trying to get around this. We do know that the people of the Bangalore region would build tanks. So basically in low-lying areas, they would wall them off. So they would collect rain through the rainy season, and they would have systems of canals to kind of distribute that water among the villages' fields, stuff like that. But we also know more broadly from other inscriptions found throughout this region of southern Karnataka, including the Hassan district, for example, that people were constantly fighting over water. We have a lot of records of hero stones which mention either that people died explicitly to defend such and such water body in a dispute between such and such villages, or hero stones that are explicitly found near a particular reservoir because that's where the fight happened. Begur, especially in the southwestern part of modern Bangalore, was a very important trading town. The chief of Begur was a chap called the Nagattara, who was a representative of a family called the Banas. So the Banas are known from fairly early on in the history of Karnataka. For example, I alluded to the Chalukyas much earlier. One of the most famous Chalukya rulers, a chap called Pulakeshin II, actually had to flee from his capital city due to a dispute with his uncle, who was the ruler of the kingdom at the time. And one of his vassals in his whole fight against his uncle were the Banas. So these guys are a fairly important kind of aspect of the minor nobility of Karnataka. There's many branches of them, of course, many cadet branches, just like any other medieval European household. And it seems that one of their branches kind of took control of Begur. The guy who ruled Begur was called the Perbana, the Big Bana, and also the Nagattara Lord. The origins of the title are a little obscure, but we do know what the crown that the Nagattara looked like. It was this interesting thing called a patta, Patta is a kind of a diadem or a kind of ribbon that was worn around the head. And the back of the patta had a number of like feathers in it. So it would have been a very interesting looking chap to come across. So the Nagatara was basically one of those, was a vassal of the Ganga king. And when I say vassal, it doesn't necessarily mean that this chap took orders from the Ganga king. More like he was basically left in charge of like a whole bunch of villages. He would extract tax from them, give a little bit to the Ganga king, and use the rest of the money to do whatever the hell he wanted. But there was also a kind of understanding between the Nagataras and the Gangas, a kind of alliance where they would exchange women, where they would coordinate in campaigns and so on, which became very important towards like the end of the 9th century. So by the late 9th century, the Rashtrakuta Empire had more or less become the default power of the Deccan. But it was also a power in decline after a few very vigorous kind of rulers. And that led to a whole bunch of like minor South Indian kings more or less going their own way, going to war with erstwhile allies of the Rashtrakutas, including, of course, the Gangas, who by this time, from being the Rashtrakutas' deadliest rivals, had become their dearest friends.
Of course.
So if you go to the Bangalore Museum today, you will see this gigantic hero stone, almost 7 foot by 7 foot, which depicts the Nagatara lord in combat against the king of Vengi. Vengi is the land between the Krishna and Godavari rivers in modern Andhra Pradesh. So the king of Vengi had apparently mounted an invasion of Gangavadi. The Ganga king ordered the Nagatara to join his army to that of Ayyappa Deva, who was the Nolamba king. The Nolambas are another kind of important little minor chiefly dynasty. Those guys kind of ruled over a swath of territory which also included the modern day Nandi Hills. Yeah. If you look at the temple that you see in Nandi Hills today, it's very much a Nolamba style temple. So this Nagatara lord of Begur joined his army to the army of Ayyappa Deva. They both went and fought against the Vengi king. And we are told that at some point the king of Vengi was on the verge of breaking through their lines with his elephant cohorts. At which point the Nagatara lord kind of ran up to kind of stem the rout on his horse and was pierced to death with javelins, but also did apparently manage to stem the rout, which led to the Vengi king kind of retreating. So once again, it is through one of those broader kind of geopolitical clashes which lead to the death of a person who lived in Bangalore that we get this fascinating insight into the broader geopolitical conditions of the time. And also through the hero stone that the Nagatara left, we get an interesting insight into just the way that the nobility of a minor Kannada household worked. If you look at the Kittaya hero stone that I mentioned, that's a very simple, kind of, honestly, a little shabby sort of hero stone. Not very prepossessing, doesn't have any great ambitions of glorifying the guy who died on it. But if you look at the Nagatara's hero stone, the thing is gigantic. It's taller than a man and much, much wider than a man. And on it, the Nagatara is sitting on a horse with this beautiful plumed crown on his head. And he's got 3 royal umbrellas being held up behind him. Obviously, so a royal umbrella is something that was associated with the most powerful kings of medieval India. Clearly, those 3 umbrellas are not meant to indicate that our man was really that important, but rather that, in death, he's meant to be regarded as that important. He's sitting on a horse, which is very beautifully done up. Like its mane is braided and decorated with tassels and jewels and gold. And he's got like a huge number of infantrymen coming up behind him wearing these short swords which are like bent at the top so they can efficiently chop off enemies' limbs in close quarters combat. And there's a whole mess of guys dying and like basically clearly all packed together and fighting in very close formations. We also see depictions of the goddess Ranabhairavi, the goddess of war, standing naked above the Nagatara watching the proceedings, standing next to a flag which would have been used perhaps for command or would originally have been painted with the emblems of the house. And we also see the Nagatara sitting in heaven, which provides us a little bit of an insight into the body culture of these people. He's sitting straight on a stool. One of his feet is up on the stool and one hand is outstretched, resting on the knee in a way that a lot of modern Indians still sit. So that's just it's really, really interesting to look at all this kind of stuff.
That's a really vivid description that you've given us. And before we move on and talk about the sweep of empires and kingdoms, can you just paint us a picture of what sort of man a Nagatara might have been like? What would have been his sources of power? Who were the people who joined his army?
Great question. So the Nagatara seems to have been, as I said, a minor chief who more or less went about his own way. His power would have stemmed from a network of alliances, from levies of troops and of taxes in kind from a number of villages that he ruled over. So think of him as basically a tiny little warlord who, in return for protecting a swath of territory, is able to extract rent and revenue from it. The Nagataras of Begur also controlled a temple called the Somanatha Temple. Then, interestingly enough, it has some kind of broad similarities to the temple that you still see in Nandi Hills, in the sense that there were originally two shrines of the god Shiva, which were built there. So it's what's called a Drikota Temple, or two peaks. So it's a temple that has two shrines and also two vimanas over it. Over centuries, of course, many peoples came and went and left their own kind of traces in the Somanatha Temple, but we'll come to that later. So one unique thing about the Somanatha Temple is if you look at the Vimana, it has some very interesting iconographical elements, including what seem to be Jain gurus. So from what we know from other inscriptions from the broader Gangavadi region, the whole area was a hotbed of Jainism. Jainism was really, really important here. In fact, if you've ever been to Shravanabalagola, where you see that gigantic monolithic statue of the Jain Tirthankara, we know for a fact that Jainism was supremely important to the elites there. Shravanabalagola itself was a great pilgrimage site where people came from hundreds of kilometers away to commit ritual death by Salekhana, which involved gradually fasting over the course of weeks, eating less and less and less until you finally just died.
Yeah.
So there seems to have been other Jain sites not too far from modern Begur as well, from which some kind of fragmentary idols have been recovered. So it seems to have been a fairly kind of eclectic society that our man ruled over. Building a temple, especially a stone temple, which would have required him to import like sthapatis and architects and sculptors, was clearly a sign that this was not just some kind of minor lord. To build something like that, you are also seeing it as an investment. It shows that you are a devout king. It shows that you are able to attract pilgrims from far and wide to come and visit. Trade would have been important because, as I mentioned, this broader Bangalore region is an important kind of stopping point for traders moving between the east and west coast. But by far the most important aspect of revenue would have been pastoralism, particularly the rearing and raiding of cows, and of course agriculture. Begur is supposed to have had a very large tank. We don't know how large the tank was back in the Nagatara's time, but the Begur lake that we see today is probably a descendant of that very same tank which was built all those generations ago. And there would have been a network of villages that the Nagatara ruled over, all of whom would have had their own tanks, their own kind of bunds, embankments, canal systems to extract as much produce out of the land as they could have. And the Nagatara, of course, as the warlord of these regions, would have been responsible for keeping raiders out and for also leading raids of his own to kind of seize cattle and to seize as much wealth as he could. There's a huge number of hero stones which have been discovered in Begur, which tell us in some very vivid detail about the lives that these people led. There's an awful lot of young village lads who seem to have died fighting for and defending cows, which again is just fascinating to me to just think of like how war-torn and raid-torn medieval India actually was. Kings in their palaces would have had the grandest of lives, would have led great mighty campaigns and battles. But the life of the average peasant sitting in his village was overwhelmingly one of hardship. People of the Deccan had to fight to survive. It was an integral part of their lives. We have a lot of inscriptions talking about how a blacksmith's son died. A blacksmith's son was commemorated on this hero stone. So these aren't people who are full-time warriors. These are people who have their own livelihoods, their own professions. But when their village is under threat, kind of seem to organize under the authority of their chief and to defend their lives and livelihoods.
Yeah, we should always remember that those Veerakallus, those hero stones that we look at admiringly today are actually symptoms of deep physical insecurity that used to exist at that time. And we shouldn't forget that. The other really characteristic thing about Bangalore is that you see inscriptions in multiple languages, not just Harle Kannada, you see Tamil. Even a casual observer like me walking around Bangalore today, I can see in the temples, Ganga architecture, Chola architecture, Hoysala architecture, and of course, Vijayanagar architecture. Can you just perform the very simple task in the time that we have left, Anirudh, of taking us from about 1000 AD to maybe 1550 AD?
By roughly 1000 AD, something really new starts to emerge in Karnataka. The Rashtrakutas fade away and are replaced by this new polity called the Kalyana Chalukyas. There is no evidence whatsoever that the Kalyana Chalukyas were descended from those older Chalukyas that I was talking about, but they claim to have, and which again I think is very telling. It tells you how certain names in India's history kind of have a brand value, if you will, which is why they're constantly resurrected by dynasties centuries and centuries after. So what these Kalyana Chalukyas do is they once again try to bind the rest of Karnataka into their broader imperial network. In fact, they come down south to Nandi Hills. If you look at the temple in Nandi Hills, there's this beautiful little tank that's been constructed within the temple premises, which seems to be an example of Kalyana Chalukya architecture. So clearly what these chaps are doing is they're trying to exhibit their patronage for the gods of the region, trying to make their power visible in temples that are popular among those of lesser dynasties, so that people are kind of acquainted with their rule. Unfortunately, the whole Kalyana Chalukya imperial project in southern Karnataka fell apart due to the rise of a far more vigorous and violent new polity, which was much closer, and those were the Cholas of Tamil. After the rise of the Cholas, so the Cholas, especially under Rajendra Chola, one of the most famous of their monarchs, back when the guy was still a prince, he's recorded to have led a massive invasion of southern Karnataka, which led with the capture of the Ganga capital, Talakadu, which was sacked. And the extension of Chola reign over much of Gangavadi, which they called Gangapati. A lot of Tamil warrior castes who signed up with Rajendra Chola were given land in Gangavadi in return for their service. And we also see a sudden eruption of Tamil inscriptions in the temples of Bangalore. So if you look at the Somanatha Temple in Bengaluru, for example, or if you look at the famous temple of Someshwara in Ulsur, where I live, the innermost sanctum sanctorum seems to have been built by Cholas. In fact, in the Someshwara temple, we have very evidently a cult of the Nayanars, the Shaiva saints, which is something that is very much associated with Chola imperial religion, especially the usage of these famous bronze images of the Nayanars that you really start to see from the 11th century or so here in Bangalore. And going further, the wars between the Cholas and Chalukyas continue. The Cholas eventually kind of fade away and are pushed out of Gangavadi by an even newer power called the Hoysellas. So the Hoysellas are basically these hill chieftains who ruled over parts of the Western Ghats, which one of their titles, interestingly enough, is Malapural Ganda, which means the man among the hill chiefs, so the big man of the hills. So these guys were basically seem to have united a number of tribes under their banner, started to, and keep in mind, so in medieval India, Adivasi tribes were nowhere near as marginalized as they are in modern India, partly because they had access to the same kind of military technology as any other contemporary kingdom, and especially because they controlled forests which had elephants. They were very often courted by other Indian kings who ruled over more settled areas. So the Hoysalas seem to recognize that there was a power vacuum in Gangavadi because of the wars of the Cholas and the Chalukyas. They start to slowly extend their power into more cultivated regions. So around the hilly regions of modern day Halebeedu, they established their capital Dwarasamudra and start to inaugurate again this interesting new dynamic period where southern Karnataka for the first time is united under what's really approaching an imperial polity. So these guys really expand their territory, start to invade Tamilakam, very famously defeat the Cholas, build these absolutely spectacular temple with a new kind of stone, soapstone and potstone, which allows for these very kind of florid, elaborately decorated temples. If you look at, again, the temple in Nandi Hills, I previously alluded to it having two shrines. The Hoysalas seem to add a third shrine between the two, which very atypically actually shows you a human kind of depiction of Shiva. So Shiva not as a linga, but Shiva as a kind of physically a person who looks like a god, marrying the goddess Parvati. And it's an absolutely beautiful little shrine with, like, again, the same kind of soapstone, potstone, this very dark, very, very detailed kind of carving that's wrought into it. Also at this time, the Somanatha Temple in Bengaluru seems to have been taken over by Chola general, which is why even today, one of the lingas is still known as Choleshwara. So the Hoysalas eventually kind of fade away due to the attacks of the Delhi Sultanate. This broader region of southern Karnataka becomes one of the most important territories of the Vijayanagara Empire. So the Vijayanagara guys once again start to inaugurate this new period of building, not necessarily in modern Bangalore itself, but especially in Belur, which was one of the old Hoysellas temple cities. The massive Gopuram or temple gateway that you see in Belur today is actually dating from the Vijayanagara period. So we are told that one of the sultans of Bijapur attacked and tried to burn down the Gopuram, but a Vijayanagara general restored it and also kind of restored the original temple dome of the Belur temple, which had collapsed due to neglect by that time. The Vijayanagara kingdom also picked up the remains of unfinished temples from Dwarasamudra, modern-day Halebeedu, and moved them to the temple of Belur and also built their own temples there. So clearly this whole broader region was one of like very fervent kind of political activity due to its importance as a kind of crossroads between the Tamil country and Karnataka. After the fading of the Vijayanagara Empire itself is when you see a chieftain for the very first time trying to establish like a truly proper walled city. And this was a chap called Kempegowda, who seems to have been a Nayaka, a military chieftain of some sort under the later Vijayanagara emperors, and who eventually kind of broke free, built his own kind of fort, and created an independent sort of township which covered many neighborhoods in modern-day northern Bangalore. If you look at the Someswara Temple in Alsur, you see that it has a very beautiful Vijayanagara period Gopuram. I remember first seeing that Gopuram when I was walking down the street outside to go to the old Takshashila office. And it just struck me that Gopuram just sitting there unassumingly, that single Gopuram was older than the United States of America. It's pretty ridiculous if you think about it. It's just sitting there like less than a kilometer from where I'm sitting right now. And that temple Gopuram again is very interesting because it kind of shows you a little bit about how the architectural language of Karnataka had changed by this time. First of all, a Vijayanagara Gopuram itself is clearly something that's inspired by Tamil models, architecture of the Pandyas and Cholas, rather than the architecture of older Kannada dynasties. But if you walk into the Someswara temple, you see within this towering Gopuram is a beautiful archway, which is clearly inspired by Islamicate architectural models, which is just fascinating to think about, right? That's the last thing you expect to see in a temple, especially given the kind of communally charged historiography of the 21st century, which assumes that Muslim and Hindu cultures, secular or religious, are totally incompatible. But right here, a kilometer away from where I'm standing is something older in the US, which testifies that was not really the case. That's not really how the people of ancient Bangalore saw it. And of course, moving forward from Kempegowda itself, Bangalore continues to be this great area of political and economic importance to many kingdoms. Tipu Sultan of Mysore, for example, it did a lot of activities in and around Bangalore. The Bangalore Fort was constructed by Tipu to act as a bastion, and he was very active around the Nandi Hills region. To this day, there is a building that you will see on the way to the Nandi Hills, which is supposed to have been a stable that was owned by the Tiger of Mysore. And of course, after the defeat of Tipu by the British, we start to enter the most recognizable period of Bangalore's history, when the town is no longer called Bengaluru, but is actually referred to as Bangalore, as you and I are calling it, Aditya.
Yeah, and that's amazing, and that whole saga from the time of Tipu to the British and independence, the growth of scientific research, defense production, IT and biotech. The Bangalore that we know today perhaps really stems from that time, around 200 or 220 years back. But even going back to the 1,000 years of history you've tried to recount for us in 30 minutes, Anirudh. I do get the sense that this is a region that has always been at the crossroads. Even today, Bangalore is not very far from the borders of both Andhra and Tamil Nadu. It is today at the crossroads of both the national and international economies as well. And I think that if we were to try and find a common thread in Bangalore's history, it is perhaps that. Thank you so much for joining us, Anirudh. This has been an amazing discussion. We'll probably take it further in future episodes. We'll probably talk about Bangalore's more recent history. But thank you, Anirudh, again, and thank you all for joining us on All Things Policy.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money. So it's been a really fun week this week. We've had a great episode with Anand Nilakanthan on Cyrus Says. Anand was one of the writers of Bahubali, and it's done some really fun stuff since that. Ashish Vidyarthi also had a really good episode on his show, Begin the Journey. Please do check that out. You do know Yuddha is back, right? Definitely check it out if you haven't. Yuddha is our show about Indian ancient warfare. It's hosted by Anirudh Kanisetti and Aditya Ramanathan. Really great show. You should check that out for sure. And I forgot. Rishikesh was on the network as well. He was on Absolutely Right with Aditi Sarana. Do definitely check that out. With that, hope to see you next week.
Entertainment is like food for the brain. It's a window to culture and a great way to understand the world around us. The internet has changed what it means to be an entertainer, creating new storytellers with millions of fans. It has spawned a new breed, the story sellers, those behind the scenes creating the business for this ecosystem. They work with brands, platforms and channels who are keen to capitalize on an audience hungrier than ever for more stories. I'm Vineet Kanabar, and I have a ringside view to how stories are told and sold. On my show, I bring you creators, artists, executives and marketers for a freewheeling conversation around the business of entertainment. Tune in to Storytellers and Story Sellers for personal stories, analysis and criticism every Thursdays as I talk to the brightest minds telling or selling great stories today.